Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Tonight's story is how the Whitman murders redefined the American West. It follows Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, missionaries whose lives intersected with tragedy, reshaping the future of the Oregon Territory. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. The wind moved quietly through the tall grass, combing the plains with fingers of cool air, as two figures crested a long, low hill. Marcus Whitman and his wife, Narcissa, had journeyed for weeks, and then for months, and now, it seemed, for lifetimes. Their wagon creaked forward, the oxen exhaling warm steam into the cold dawn. Behind them stretched the trail they had conquered, mud-caked and silent. Ahead, the unclaimed vastness of Oregon country, veiled in mist. Marcus believed they were walking into divine destiny. Narcissa, wrapped tightly in wool, believed they were walking into history. In 1836, the American West wasn't yet America. It was wilderness wrapped in story, unmapped, unmeasured, and too often misunderstood. Still, the call to cross it rang out like a hymn and a dare. Missionaries, farmers, and wanderers alike answered. Marcus and Narcissa weren't just pioneers, they were among the first white women and men to traverse the continent by wagon. Narcissa, in fact, was the first white woman to make the overland journey. She walked most of the way, yet walked because space was tight and wheels were bumpy, and well, she had strong legs and even stronger faith. They passed buffalo, wolves, stars, too bright to sleep beneath. They sang hymns at rivers, prayed in storms, and once, Marcus swatted at a mosquito only to tumble backward into a muddy creek. Narcissa laughed so hard she nearly joined him. That night, he dried out by firelight, muttering about holy patience and swampy socks. But this was their mission, to bring Christianity to the native peoples of the West. They weren't explorers, exactly. They came bearing Bibles and quinine, not compasses. Still, every footstep marked territory, every prayer planted a flag. Whether they meant to or not, they weren't alone. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, a mouthful of a title and a very serious group back east, had sent them with high hopes. This wasn't just about souls, it was about civilization. At least, their version of it. By the time they reached the land of the Cayuse people, nestled near the Walla Walla River, they were exhausted, weather-worn, and still smiling. Marcus chose a spot to build flat, fertile, open. He believed it ideal for planting both crops and faith. Narcissa planted flowers first. The Cayuse watched them with interest, then confusion, then caution. They had seen white traders before, with blankets and muskets, but this was different. These newcomers prayed out loud, built square houses, taught their children to sit still, and they stayed. Still, there was peace. At first, Cayuse families came to trade, to talk. Some even sent their children to the Whitmans' little school. Marcus tried to teach farming methods. Narcissa taught scripture and, sometimes, baking. She gave out apples wrapped in cloth, telling wide-eyed children that kindness was God's recipe. But under the surface, something tight and quiet trembled, like a taut string waiting to snap. Language was a wall they could barely climb. Marcus, stubborn and self-assured, had little patience for the subtleties of Cayuse speech. He believed his medical skills, honed in New York, would speak for themselves. Healing, after all, was a universal language, or so he thought, and yet he was kind to many. Earnest, if firm, Narcissa, too, offered real affection. But affection doesn't erase arrogance. They were guests acting like hosts, and the Cayuse, whose ancestors had walked that land for countless generations, noticed. Still, the mission grew. Fields of wheat ripened under Narcissa's care. A small chapel rose with hand-hewn beams. Horses were traded. Babies were born. And sometimes, at dusk, the valley was quiet enough to forget the distance between them. One evening, Marcus and Narcissa walked along the riverbank. A heron lifted into the sky, its wings silent as prayer. She leaned into him. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked softly. "To God," he replied, "or to me." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The mission was a seed, a small thing in vast soil. But in that soil lay tensions, spiritual, cultural, personal, and seeds, as we know, don't always grow the way we hope. Sometimes they break the ground. By the early 1840s, the Whitmans were still there, still working, still waiting. Their letters home were filled with God's work and homesickness, scripture and sewing tips. Narcissa missed her sister's tea. Marcus missed shoes that didn't leak. But the West was changing. More wagons appeared. On the horizon, more people, more noise, and under all of it, the Cayuse watched, listened, counted. Marcus and Narcissa had dreamed of a garden, a place where two peoples could meet in peace. But gardens need more than seeds. They need understanding, trust, and space. The Whitmans had crossed a continent to find their purpose, but they had also crossed into another world when with rules they didn't understand, and consequences they couldn't see. That spring, a Cayuse elder gifted Marcus a finely carved pipe, a gesture of peace, perhaps, or curiosity. Marcus smiled, thanked him, and placed it on the mantel. He never smoked it. Too busy, too many chores, too many sermons. But that pipe stayed there, watching, a silent witness, waiting, and the river kept flowing. The wind moved differently now. At first, it was subtle, a shift in tone, a quiet turning of the seasons. Marcus Whitman continued his work, riding between distant native villages and the mission house at Walla Walla. Narcissa kept the house orderly, the school running, the garden neat, though fewer Cayuse children came now. The distance between host and guest, between healer and healed, was widening. It had started with good intentions, but intentions like apples can bruise without anyone noticing. The Cayuse people, who had lived along the rivers and plateaus of what would one day be called the Pacific Northwest, were practical, generous, and rooted in custom. Their world wasn't a place to be converted. It was already full of spirit. Every stream, stone, and elder carried sacred weight. Marcus saw medicine as his bridge. He treated wounds, stitched skin, calmed fevers. He had a calm, gentle hand. But what he didn't see was how easily medicine became mistrusted when it worked for some and not others. When white children lived and Cayuse children died, the Cayuse watched him closely. They respected power. They understood healing. But they also believed that a healer who failed could be dangerous. And by the 1840s, more and more of their people were dying, mostly from diseases they had never known before: measles, scarlet, fever, influenza. Illness came in invisible waves, and Marcus, he kept treating patients. He did his best, but he never understood how different his presence looked from the other side of the table. Narcissa, too, noticed the change. She stopped hosting as many tea visits. The Cayuse women she had once taught to bake rarely came by anymore. She wrote in her letters of loneliness and the coldness that seemed to have crept into the land itself. She still set the table with care, but some chairs remained empty. One morning, a Cayuse mother brought her feverish child to the mission. Marcus examined the girl, and offered her the usual remedies: boiled willow bark, cool compresses, prayer. But within days, the child was dead. The mother did not cry. She left without speaking. That evening, a Cayuse man lingered near the edge of the wheat field, watching, silent. Marcus waved once. The man did not wave back. A new mood was settling over Walla Walla. The settlers arriving along the Oregon Trail, tired, hungry, and often ill, began to see the mission as more than a religious outpost. It became a way station, a small fortress of civilization in an uncertain land. The Whitmans welcomed them with bread, blankets, and prayers. But every newcomer brought with them more than just stories. They brought disease, and the Cayuse knew this. They watched as the mission swelled with white faces that coughed, burned with fever, then, usually, recovered. Their own people weren't so lucky. By now, Marcus had grown more certain, not less. He believed the mission could still succeed, if only they worked harder, believed harder, prayed harder. He still rode out each week, doctor's bag rattling behind him, offering medicine and sermons. But his eyes were tired, and his heart, though full of conviction, beat under the weight of a growing sorrow. He tried to explain things to the Cayuse elders, tried to tell them about germs, contagion, airborne particles, but these were words without weight in a world that saw sickness not as random, but as the result of imbalance, of spiritual wrongdoing, of betrayal. And who, the Cayuse wondered, had brought the sickness? One winter, a small group of Cayuse men stood outside the mission house, quiet as stones. Marcus stepped out to meet them, boots crunching through frost. They didn't speak for a long time. Then one of them said, "Why do your people not die?" Marcus hesitated. He answered as gently as he could, speaking of strong stomachs, good food, lucky breaks. But he felt the words fall like stones into deep water. The men nodded once, then turned away. That night, Narcissa dreamed of fire. She had begun to feel a kind of tremor in her bones. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter, like when you find a cracked teacups, still beautiful, but never quite safe to use again. She continued her routine, teaching, cooking, praying, but she locked the front door each night now. She hadn't done that before. Marcus refused to see the danger. He still believed in his mission. He had walked too far, sacrificed too much. To him, trust would return, harmony would return. God would reward their patience. He couldn't see that patience was the very thing slipping away. One boy, a Cayuse teenager named Tillocaked, had once attended Marcus's school. He had sat quietly in the back, listening, observing. He had learned some English, enough to ask questions. Now he avoided the mission, but still passed by sometimes on horseback, his expression unreadable. He carried a small knife in his boot, though no one knew it. Across the valley, whispers passed from one village to another, whispers of betrayal, of disease as a weapon, of healing turned deadly. No one said Marcus's name out loud, but everyone thought it. Narcissa, sweeping the schoolroom one afternoon, paused by the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Light flakes, gentle. She watched them settle on the bare branches, soft and white, beautiful and fleeting. She remembered a song her mother used to hum when she was little, something about sparrows and watching and wings. She hummed it now, under her breath, as the first shadow passed across the snow. It was Tillocaked. He didn't knock, just watched for a moment, then rode on inside. The fire crackled. The kettle sang. Outside, winter thickened. The mission, once a beacon, had become a fault line, and beneath it, pressure built. But no one, not even Marcus or Narcissa, could see how close it had come to breaking. Snow turned the valley quiet, as if the world had taken a long, slow breath. The fields slept under a white sheet. The river moved in sluggish ripples, muffled beneath ice. The wind curled through trees like a careful whisper. But inside the Cayuse villages, peace was not what filled the silence. Grief did a cough, a fever, a child dying, then another. The sickness came in waves, and no one could stop it. Families wrapped small bodies in furs and sat in silence, mourning the invisible enemy that moved from one home to the next. The Cayuse knew the land. They knew its rhythm, its dangers. But this sickness, they didn't understand it. It wasn't natural, it didn't belong, and it was following the settlers. Marcus Whitman, still riding from place to place with his worn medical bag, did what he could. He treated whoever came to him, white native, rich or poor, but the results were uneven. To the Cayuse, it began to look like he only saved his own. Their children died. His did not. Some began to say it out loud. Whitman is the poison. He had no way of knowing how deeply this fear had taken root. He believed he was serving. He believed he was healing. But belief, no matter how strong, can't quiet suspicion or erase mourning. One boy, no older than 7, had been brought to the mission coughing violently, fever burning through his skin. Narcissa cradled him by the fire, while Marcus prepared his remedies, willow bark tea and cool cloths. But by dawn, the child was gone. His mother didn't cry. She only touched her son's hair, then stood and left. She never came back. Marcus said a prayer over the small body. Narcissa wiped her eyes. The silence in the room was so deep it rang in their ears. The next morning, someone left a woven talisman at the mission's front gate. Twisted grass, feathers, red thread, a warning. Still, Marcus refused to believe what was forming around him. He had too many settlers to help. Families kept arriving from back east, wheezing and shivering, bringing tales of hardship and prayers for sanctuary. He gave what he could: tonics, blankets, sermons about endurance. He even helped dig graves when necessary, his hands raw in the frozen earth. But each settler meant more risk. Each wagon carried not just people, but disease. And to the Cayuse, the pattern was becoming clear. That winter, the mission's tiny graveyard grew by 6 more mounds. Marcus stood at each one, eyes closed, hands folded. But behind him, Cayuse's eyes watched not in reverence, but calculation. He was burying lives, and to them, it looked like he had taken them. Word spread in hushed tones. Marcus was a sorcerer, not a healer. A man with power who chose, who lived, and who died. Narcissa began to lock the doors before sunset. She spoke less in her letters home, replacing her once cheerful tone with clipped, careful notes. She felt it now too, something shifting, something tightening. Even the garden felt different. No birds at the feeder, no children's laughter outside the schoolhouse. Just the wind and the kettle and the echo of a door closing. One night, as Marcus sat mending a coat by firelight, he heard something: soft footsteps on the porch. He stood, opened the door. No one there, but a handprint was left in the snow, small, bare. He didn't sleep much that night. Meanwhile, Tilhokate had been listening to the elders. He heard the way they spoke of the old days, before horses, before fences, before fever came. He knew what needed to be done. He wasn't alone. A quiet group began to form, men who believed the mission was the source of sickness, who believed the healer had become the disease, and who, in the deep shadow of winter, began to plan. Back at the mission, Narcissa tried to carry on. She baked bread, she read scriptures, she sang hymns to herself while sweeping. But the warmth she once brought to the place had faded into formality. She was trying, but her heart was tired. She missed her daughter, Alice Clarissa, who had drowned years earlier in the river near the mission. A tiny, silent tragedy that never left her. She thought of her often now, in the silence, in the smell of baking apples, in the lonely stillness of twilight, and outside. The snow fell again, softly, slowly, covering the world like a lullaby. The settlers, meanwhile, were pressing westward in greater numbers. They spoke of land, opportunity, and divine providence. To Marcus, this was encouraging proof that their mission was part of something larger. He believed their work was bearing fruit, but the Cayuse saw the fruit differently. With each new arrival, their land felt smaller, their world more crowded, their stories drowned out, and so they began to whisper back, "The time is coming." They didn't know the name for the disease. They only knew it killed their children, and that Marcus's hands were always there. It didn't matter how many prayers he offered. It didn't matter how earnestly Narcissa baked or taught. Trust had evaporated. In its place stood fear. And fear, like illness, spreads fast. One morning Narcissa found red clay smeared across the chapel door, a symbol ancient and full of meaning. She cleaned it off with trembling hands. She didn't tell Marcus, she simply set the kettle to boil, and kept her eyes on the door for the rest of the day. Somewhere in the distance, Tilloutcaked was sharpening a knife, not for war, for a decision. The mission, once alive with songs and stories, now felt like a stage before a final act. The air was too quiet, the footsteps too soft, and the sun, even when it shone, felt cold. Marcus didn't see it, not clearly, not yet, but Narcissa did. She knew a silence was growing that even her voice couldn't reach, and beyond the trees, in the waiting dark, the storm was almost here. The dawn came dull and heavy. Gray clouds hung low over the hills, as if they were watching. A thin mist drifted across the valley, wrapping the mission in a quiet veil. Narcissa awoke to the smell of damp wood and cold ashes. She sat up slowly, her breath forming soft clouds in the morning air. Marcus was already downstairs, stirring the fire. He didn't say much, just nodded and handed her a mug of warm tea. Outside, the yard was still. No children's laughter, no footsteps, just wind and waiting. The Cayuse were no longer visiting. The last patient had come 3 days. Earlier, an old man with red eyes and trembling hands. Marcus had tried to treat him. He'd sat by the bedside, offered warm broth and willow bark tincture. The man had died at sunset, and that had been the last dot inside the village. Grief turned to silence. Silence turned to resolve. Tilloukaikt, and his companions met under the trees, where the light struggled to break through. They did not yell, they did not rage. Their plan was not wild. It was careful, controlled, like a knife placed neatly on a table. They believed they were preserving their people, that by cutting out the source of sickness, they would protect the children who remained. In the old stories, healers who brought death were judged. Justice was not a punishment, it was balance. At the mission, the Whitmans had no idea what was coming. Marcus moved through the days with quiet certainty. He was tired, but still hopeful. Narcissa kept up her chores, writing, cooking, teaching. A few children still came to her classroom, mostly settler children now. She missed the Cayuse girls who used to sit in the back, whispering to each other and laughing at her attempts to pronounce their names. The schoolroom was too quiet. On the last morning, the mist never lifted. It curled around the mission buildings like breath on glass. Marcus stood on the porch, coat buttoned surveying the field. He saw shapes moving in the fog, figures on horseback, walking slowly toward the gate. It wasn't unusual for Cayuse to visit, even unannounced, but something felt different this time. They came in a group, 7 men, calm, steady, dressed for the cold. One of them carried a musket, another had a knife in his belt. Marcus greeted them with the same quiet voice he always used. He invited them inside. Narcissa was in the kitchen. She heard the voices, the footsteps. She paused, her hand resting on the bread dough. Something in her chest tightened. Her heartbeat slowed, then sped up again. She wiped her hands on her apron. Then came a sound that didn't belong. A thud, then another. A sudden cry, brief, sharp, cut off. She stepped toward the door, and then the world changed. The next moments came fast and slow at once. Tilhau caked, struck first. Marcus fell to the floor, blood seeping through his shirt. His eyes wide, still trying to understand. Others moved through the mission, silent as snow. Doors burst open. Screams echoed. Men, women, and children, all inside the compound, were caught in the storm. Narcissa tried to gather the younger children, pulling them into the kitchen, pushing a table against the door. Her hands shook. She whispered, she, over and over again. A boy cried. A girl clung to her skirts. Outside, flames began to rise. Smoke curled like fingers through the air. It was not chaos, it was purpose. In less than an hour, 13 people were dead. Marcus Whitman, several settler men, 2 children, 1 young woman. Others were taken hostages, mostly women and children, held as leverage, as negotiation tools. The Cayuse were not mindless in their violence. They knew there would be consequences. They intended to speak through their actions, but nothing they said would be heard. Word of the killings spread quickly. When news reached the nearby settlements, horror bloomed. The Whitmans were beloved in some circles, seen as martyrs, missionaries, who had sacrificed everything. The Cayuse, once seen as noble or curious, were now labeled murderers. The settlers demanded justice, revenge. The Whitman massacre, as it came to be called, became a rallying cry. Militias formed. Riders carried the story from village to village, town to town. Some exaggerated it, some added gruesome details, but none questioned the central idea. The Cayuse had killed without cause. There was no mention of the measles, or the years of encroachment, or the slow erosion of trust, just blood. The territorial government declared war, and just like that, the Cayuse War began. It lasted 5 years. In the hills and valleys of Oregon country, violence erupted. Homes burned, warriors and soldiers clashed, and always the shadow of the Whitmans lingered, as though their deaths demanded more. In the end, 5 Cayuse men were handed over by their own people, some say, to save the tribe from annihilation. Tilhau was one of them. They stood trial in a white man's court, judged by foreign laws, in a language not their own. The outcome was never in doubt. All 5 were hanged. They died with no last words recorded. The mission at Walla Walla fell silent, its walls blackened with smoke, its fields overgrown. A place of peace turned graveyard. And Narcissa, she died in the attack, alongside Marcus. Her last moments, as far as anyone could say, were spent sheltering children. They say her hands were still holding one of them when they found her. The wind that once carried hymns now whistled through broken beams. The valley remembered, and for many years, nothing grew there. Snow melted slowly, as if the land itself were reluctant to let go of what had happened. The valley breathed in again, but it was different, now quieter, heavier. The fields that once shimmered with wheat lay empty. The garden behind the mission was tangled and bare. No children's voices, no firelight in the windows, just ash, old wood, and the soft rustling of ghosts. Word of the massacre, and of the war that followed, had stretched far beyond the frontier. Back east, newspapers carried dramatic headlines, some calling Marcus Whitman a martyr, others questioning the mission's place in an already fragile landscape. Few asked why the Cayuse had struck, but the missionaries who came after, they remembered. They walked the same paths, felt the same tension underfoot. The mission was never rebuilt. Instead, a new wave of settlers arrived not to preach, but to claim, to fence, to file deeds, and slowly the land changed. Where once had stood a careful balance between settler and native, now only one remained. The Cayuse people, fractured by war, disease, and loss, were pushed onto reservations. Their territory signed away in brittle treaties. No one sang in the schoolhouse anymore. But time moved forward. Decades later, someone placed a simple stone marker at the site of the mission. No grand memorial, just a small plaque with the Whitmans' names and the year 1847. Wild grass curled around it. Occasionally, a bird would land there. A child passing through with a parent might read the names aloud, but the wind always carried more than what the plaque could say. The story of the Whitman murders, told and retold, became part of the myth of the American West. To some, it was a tale of savagery met with sacrifice. To others, a warning about the costs of imperialism disguised as salvation. But beneath the layers of history and retelling, something quieter remained, a truth neither sharp nor loud, but steady as the river that once ran beside the mission, that people, even with the best of intentions, can become the instruments of pain, that sickness is not always just of the body, and that trust, once broken, doesn't heal the way skin does. In classrooms, the story was simplified. In textbooks, the Whitmans were pioneers, the Cayuse just a footnote, a paragraph. Near the bottom of the page, teachers might pause on it. Some might not. Children would draw wagons, sing songs about westward expansion, never quite knowing what had been traded for that dream. Still, the land remembered. The valley, even in summer, held onto its hush. Shadows lingered longer. Birds passed overhead without landing. One spring, a local historian, an old woman with a habit of humming while she walked, brought a group of students to the site. She showed them the marker, told them the real story, the whole one. She knelt in the grass, brushed aside some leaves, and uncovered a second stone's molar, unmarked. Some say this is where one of the Cayuse children was buried, she said softly, but no one knows for sure. The children were quiet. One of them reached out, touched the stone with their fingers, and in that moment, the wind shifted. The storyteller's voice dropped. They were all just people, she said, trying, hurting, hoping. Later that night, the sky turned violet over the hills, the same sky Marcus and Narcissa once watched, standing arm in arm after a long day's work. The same sky the Cayuse elders used to read like scripture, watching for signs, for meaning. Stars blinked above, distant and untroubled, and down below, a river still ran, patient and steady as it always had. A boy skipping stones along the bank might pause, feeling something he couldn't name. An ache, a hush, a question. Why? Why did it end like this? And what could have been different? But questions, like rivers, don't always rush to answers. They wind, they wait, they carve their path slowly, gently wearing down even the hardest stone. Just as the memory of that day, the cold, the quiet, the sudden crack of violence carved itself into the land. The Cayuse who survived carried the story in their blood, in their songs, in the way they looked east with wary eyes. The settlers who came after, with shovels and saws and bright dreams, built towns and roads. Most never asked what had come before, but sometimes, at night, under a heavy moon, an old-timer might sit by a fire and say, "You ever hear about the Whitman place?" And someone younger would listen not just to the story, but to the pause that came after, the space between words, where the grief still lived. One day, an artist came to the valley. She was young, quiet, carried a notebook and a small tin of watercolors. She set up an easel by the river, just where the mission used to stand. She didn't paint buildings or graves. She painted the mist, gray-white, soft dot, and if you looked close, there were shapes in it. A child's hand, a woman's braid, a man holding out a blanket, and just behind them, shadowed but visible, a line of riders on horseback, moving slowly toward the mission. Not in hate, not in peace, just arriving. The artist never sold the painting. She kept it on her wall, above her bed, where she could look at it before sleep. And every night, before turning off the light, she'd whisper the same words, "Let me remember, let me not forget," because stories, even the hardest ones, are how we carry the past, not to hold it, but to shape what comes next. The rain began softly, like a lullaby for the valley. It tapped on tall grass, traced rivulets in the dirt paths, and settled gently over the broken stones where the mission once stood. The land didn't resist, it just drank, slowly, as if trying to forget and remember at the same time. Years became generations. The memory of the Whitmans, of the Cayuse, of the unspoken space between them, changed shape again. No longer just tragedy, no longer just martyrdom, but something more complicated. A riddle whispered across seasons. In a small house near Pendleton, a Cayuse grandmother sat by a kitchen window, peeling apples for a pie. Her granddaughter sat at her feet, a book open in her lap. It was a school history text, simple, neat, and so very quiet about what had happened. "They don't get it right," the grandmother murmured. The girl looked up. "Why don't they fix it?" The woman smiled, slow and sad. "Because some truths don't fit clean on a page, baby. You gotta carry them in your bones." Outside, wind stirred the apple trees. One branch tapped the window, as if to agree. That same day, in a different part of the valley, a historical reenactment was held. Men in buckskin, women in bonnets, children lined up to churn butter, ride in a covered wagon, touch the painted canvas of a tipi. A young reenactor, barely 17, stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a leather vest, but his gaze was distant. He held a flyer in his hand, the headline bold, "Come see the frontier, come alive." He turned it over. Nothing on the back. Nothing about the Cayuse, nothing about the fever, nothing about what was lost. He folded the flyer into a paper bird and let it go. It caught a breeze, danced above the heads of laughing children, then vanished into the trees. History, it seemed, always flew just out of reach, but in quiet places, people still tried to hold it. One such place was a library, tucked between a post office and a bakery. In its farthest corner, a small collection of first-hand accounts had been carefully preserved, letters from Narcissa, field notes from Marcus, and oral testimony transcribed from Cayuse elders. Brittle from age, a young researcher, working late, one evening discovered something surprising. A forgotten draft of a sermon Marcus had written, but never delivered. It was unpolished, more question than proclamation. In it, he wondered if he had misunderstood the very people he came to save. He wrote of their generosity, of a peace he hadn't expected, and he asked, in ink faded but legible, whether his mission had truly been God's will or his own. The researcher stared at that sentence for a long time. She didn't write a paper about it, she just copied the line into her notebook. Later that year, the local high school revised its curriculum. The new unit was called Many Truths of the West. Students now heard more than just names. They heard songs, read poems, listened to voices that weren't filtered through textbooks. One of the lessons featured two recordings. The first was a reading of Narcissa's last letter home. The second, a Cayuse story about the time before white men walked the valleys, when rivers spoke and owls gave warnings. At first, the students didn't know what to make of the pairing, but as they really listened, something softened in the room. One girl raised her hand and said, "It sounds like both sides lost." The teacher nodded, yes, and neither wanted to. In Walla Walla, an artist painted a mural along the side of the local museum. It stretched the length of the building, not just a single scene, but a winding series of images: a wagon under a golden sky, a Cayuse rider beneath a blood moon, hands extended, not touching, a fevered child. And at the very end, two figures seated under a tree, one pale, one dark, neither speaking, just watching the same river. At the mural's base, in small letters read, "Not who was right, who was forgotten." People took pictures. Some walked past, some stopped and cried. In the end, what mattered wasn't just the retelling, it was the remembering, because history doesn't always scream. Sometimes it murmurs behind the clatter of everyday life. Sometimes it sings softly in kitchens, in libraries, in classrooms, in the wind, and sometimes it simply waits for someone willing to hear the story without trying to rewrite it. Waits for someone to ask not just what happened, but who paid for what happened. The Cayuse, still here, still living, now host cultural gatherings open to the public. Drumming rises into the night sky. Dancers move in circles, grounded, graceful. Elders tell the stories, their voices low, steady, carved with time, and somewhere in the crowd, always, someone hears the story for the first time and doesn't forget. The Whitman murders no longer belong to just the pages of a textbook. They belong to a shared inheritance, messy, painful, vital, because in remembering the moment when everything broke, we find the cracks we still carry. We find the places that need healing, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we find a way to begin again, not by forgetting, but by facing what was lost with honesty and care. And when the rain falls again, as it always does, it falls on everyone, evenly, gently, like a promise that maybe, one day, the land will know peace, real peace, not silence, but understanding. The moon rose slow and pale over the hills, casting soft silver over the valley once soaked in fire. There were no sounds now but those the earth allowed, a low breeze moving through tall grasses, the creak of an old cedar, and somewhere in the distance, an owl calling once, then waiting. The land, so long burdened by memory, had settled into a kind of quiet dot, not forgetfulness, just quiet dot. At the edge of the old mission site, a bench faced the river. On it sat a man, older now, with hands lined by work and weather. He wasn't famous. He hadn't written books, but he had listened. For years, he came here sometimes in the evenings, not to mourn or judge, but to sit, to watch the water move endlessly forward, never the same, never quite different. Tonight, beside him, sat a young boy, his grandson. "Tell me again," the boy said, voice hushed, And so the man did. He told of Narcissa and Marcus crossing the great country with wagons and hymns. He spoke gently of the Cayuse, their open hearts, their careful observations. He told of how sickness came uninvited, and how grief blurred the lines between mercy and mistake. The boy listened without interrupting. When the story reached its paraphorophik, the fever, the loss, the final moments, the boy's eyes grew wide. But why didn't they just talk to each other? He asked. The old man smiled. Sometimes people think they already understand, and when they think that, they stop listening. The boy looked back at the river, thoughtful. It shimmered in the moonlight, like liquid memory. He leaned his head on his grandfather's shoulder and whispered, "Then we should always listen." And the old man, with a voice like dust and kindness, said, "Yes, we should." As they sat, clouds drifted past the moon, softening its light. The ground breathed beneath them, alive with roots and quiet stories. Across the state, in homes and museums and classrooms, others were telling the story, too. Some added their own memories. Some only repeated what they'd learned. But in each voice, there was a rhythm beginning to emerge, flow, thoughtful, like the turning of a page in hands that know how fragile paper can be, and fragile it is, history. When poorly held, cracks. But when carried carefully, it glows. Some nights, a park ranger leaves small white stones in a circle near the base of the old chimney that still stands at the mission site. She never explains why, and most never notice, but a few do. And when they ask, she says simply, "For those who aren't named in the plaques." One evening, an elder from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla stood before a small gathering, a folded paper in his hand. He was not young anymore, but his voice still carried warmth. He told the story not as a condemnation and not as forgiveness, but as witness. "I don't want you to feel guilty," he said, looking around. "I want you to feel responsible. That's different." He unfolded the paper, read aloud the names of the 5 Cayuse men who were hanged after the Whitman killings. Their names, once spoken only in hushed corners or forgotten records, rose clearly into the air. Then he folded the paper again, tucked it away, and said, "No more. It was enough." And now, as the stars thickened in the night sky, as porch lights blinked out and windows grew dark, the story continued, carried softly in the dreams of those who had heard it. A woman in Portland drifted to sleep after reading an old journal by Narcissa Whitman, her heart aching not for the missionaries' righteousness, but for her loneliness. A boy in Toppenish rolled over in bed, thinking of the stone circle at the mission site, wondering if he might visit someday, just to stand there, just to feel it. A teacher in Spokane, sitting at her desk after grading papers, printed one more article, this one from the tribal archivan, slid it into her lesson plan. In each quiet place, in each quiet life, the story took root not to haunt, but to heal, because, in the end, history is not about heroes or villains. It's about people, people who tried, people who failed, people who feared, who hoped, who hurt, and when their stories are told fully, honestly, and gently, they do not burn, they guide. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, wrapped in your blankets, feel the weight of this story settle beside you. Not heavy, no, just present. A reminder that even in a quiet room, far from rivers and wagons and wide plains, you can carry something true, not to change the past, but to honor it. So let the wind move through the trees. Now let the stars blink slowly overhead. Let the river run where it may. And sleep. The story will wait for you here, whenever you wish to remember. So breathe slow, sink deeper into your bed. Let your body go still, your mind soften, your breath quiet. The story is done for now. you did well to listen. The moon rose slow and pale over the hills, casting soft silver over the valley once soaked in fire. There were no sounds now but those the earth allowed, a low breeze moving through tall grasses, the creak of an old cedar, and somewhere in the distance an owl calling once, then waiting. The land, so long burdened by memory, had settled into a kind of quiet dot, not forgetfulness, just quiet dot at the edge of the old mission site. A bench faced the river. On it sat a man, older now, with hands lined by work and weather. He wasn't famous. He hadn't written books, but he had listened. For years, he came here sometimes in the evenings, not to mourn or judge, but to sit, to watch the water move endlessly forward, never the same, never quite different. Tonight, beside him, sat a young boy, his grandson. "Tell me again," the boy said, voice hushed, and so the man did. He told of Narcissa and Marcus, crossing the great country with wagons and hymns. He spoke gently of the Cayuse, their open hearts, their careful observations. He told of how sickness came, uninvited, and how grief blurred the lines between mercy and mistake. The boy listened, without interrupting. When the story reached its sorrowful peak, the fever, the loss, the final moments, the boy's eyes grew wide. "But why didn't they just talk to each other?" he asked. The old man smiled. "Sometimes people think they already understand, and when they think that, they stop listening." The boy looked back at the river, thoughtful. It shimmered in the moonlight, like liquid memory. He leaned his head on his grandfather's shoulder and whispered, "Then we should always listen." And the old man, with a voice like dust and kindness, said, "Yes, we should." As they sat, clouds drifted past the moon, softening its light. The ground breathed beneath them, alive with roots and quiet stories. Across the state, in homes and museums and classrooms, others were telling the story, too. Some added their own memories. Some only repeated what they'd learned. But in each voice, there was a rhythm beginning to emerge, thoughtful, like the turning of a page in hands that know how fragile paper can be, and fragile it is, history. When poorly held, cracks, but when carried carefully, it glows, some nights. A park ranger leaves small white stones in a circle near the base of the old chimney that still stands at the mission site. She never explains why, and most never notice, but a few do. And when they ask, she says simply, "For those who aren't named in the plaques." One evening, an elder from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla stood before a small gathering, a folded paper in his hand. He was not young anymore, but his voice still carried warmth. He told the story not as a condemnation, and not as forgiveness, but as witness. "I don't want you to feel guilty," he said, looking around. "I want you to feel responsible. That's different." He unfolded the paper, read aloud the names of the 5 Cayuse men who were hanged after the Whitman killings. Their names, once spoken only in hushed corners or forgotten records, rose clearly into the air. Then he folded the paper again, tucked it away, and said no more. It was enough. And now, as the stars thickened in the night sky, as porch lights blinked out and windows grew dark, the story continued, carried softly in the dreams of those who had heard it. A woman in Portland drifted to sleep after reading an old journal by Narcissa Whitman, her heart aching not for the missionaries' righteousness, but for her loneliness. A boy in Topanish rolled over in bed, thinking of the stone circle at the mission site, wondering if he might visit someday, just to stand there, just to feel it. A teacher in Spokane, sitting at her desk after grading papers, printed one more article, This one from the tribal archive slid it into her lesson plan. In each quiet place, in each quiet life, the story took root. Not to haunt, but to heal, because, in the end, history is not about heroes or villains. It's about people, people who tried, people who failed, people who feared, who hoped, who hurt, and when their stories are told fully, honestly, and gently, they do not burn, they guide. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, wrapped in your blankets, feel the weight of this story settle beside you. Not heavy, no, just present, a reminder that even in a quiet room, far from rivers and wagons and wide plains, you can carry something true, not to change the past, but to honor it. So let the wind move through the trees now. Let the stars blink slowly overhead. Let the river run where it may. And sleep. The story will wait for you here, whenever you wish to remember. And now, the night is nearly complete. The story of the Whitman murders, so often told in fragments or absolutes, has unfolded here like a quiet map, one etched not only in events, but in emotions. It began with dreams, a young couple chasing faith across a wild continent. It met the reality of a nation already alive with people, cultures, and centuries of wisdom. It crashed where misunderstanding met sickness, and hearts broke before they ever had a chance to fully open. We walked the length of that story together through the mission's founding, the growing tensions, the terrible fever, and the tragic deaths that followed. We witnessed the sorrowful execution of 5 Cayuse men, and we saw how a single moment of bloodshed redefined an entire region. But we also saw how stories evolve, how they are softened, reframed, questioned, and reclaimed by the voices too long left out. The past is not frozen. It stirs in the voices of elders, in the eyes of children, and in the pages rewritten by those who finally listened. The land remembers, in its own way, and tonight, as you drift into sleep, may you carry not just the facts of what happened, but the feelings, the silence after, the responsibility of memory. You now hold a thread in a much larger tapestry. Rest well, knowing that truth, even when painful, can still be gentle, that listening matters, that stories, when told right, make space, not just for knowledge, but for peace. So breathe slow, sink deeper into your bed, let your body go still, your mind soften, your breath quiet. The story is done for now. You did well to listen. Good night.